Welcome to another Village Arts Insights. I'm your co-host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan.
Jessica Sebastian, art therapist.
And I have been curious, as many of you might also be, about these paintings we have in our building. We have them in two locations by the famous artist Marc Chagall. So you can see four of them behind us in near the bird cage, and we'll also be traveling later on over to Oakview where we have some more. So Marc Chagall stuff, his paintings. This is a real blessing that we have some of his artwork right here in our building.
It's really an incredible thing that we have so many of these here in the building. It was one of the first things I noticed when I began working here. I've always been a Chagall fan. And so to be able to walk by them every day at work is just really wonderful for me. It happens to be an artist that I know a lot about because I've always been interested in Chagall's work. So I'm really excited to share some of my knowledge with you guys today.
Wonderful.
All right, so we're going to eventually be focusing on the pieces, but I thought for some of you that may not know a lot about Marc Chagall, this would be an opportunity to share a little bit of knowledge. So
especially since you were a fan of his even before working here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So prior to going to school for art therapy, I actually studied art history for many years, worked in many museums. So I've had an opportunity to study Chagall over the years, especially when I worked at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I got to walk by some of his artwork every day there at work as well.
Wonderful.
So a little bit of background on who is Chagall. I'm sure everybody's heard the name, but you may not know any history about him. Mm-hmm. So Chagall was born in 1887 in Russia, in Vitebsk. It's now Belarus. It would be an area that we would know as Belarus now. To a Lithuanian Jewish family. He was the oldest of 9 children, big family, and his father was a herring merchant. So very hard labor.
But it sounds delicious.
Yes, absolutely. And his mother sold groceries out of their home because she also was caring for 9 children, so she had her hands full. Most of what we know about Chagall's early life comes from his autobiography, which is called My Life. It'd be a great thing to have in our library here for us to check out. So as a child, Chagall attended a local Jewish school because Jewish children were not allowed to attend Russian schools at that time. But at the age of 13, his mother said, no, he needs more. So she went to a professor at the local Russian school and bribed them with 50 rubles to take her son, and he agreed. It was a great opportunity for Chagall, and it actually led him to what we know now as being a great artist. In class one day, he looks over and he sees a classmate drawing. And his mind is just like, pow, what is happening here? Because he recalls that as a child, there was absolutely no art in his home.
Oh, wow.
He had no exposure to art whatsoever. And so he asks this classmate, what are you doing? Like, what is this I'm seeing here? How did you learn to do that? And the classmate just doesn't even know how to respond. He's like, I don't understand, I'm drawing. I look at a picture, I get a book out of the library, and I copy it. What more is there to know? So that's what Chagall did. He went to the library, checked out some books, and started copying images at the age of 13, which was his very first exposure. So just after he had started drawing and discovering art, as he wandered through town, Chagall noticed that there was an art studio in town, an artist named Yehuda Penn. And this was a portrait artist, but Chagall was willing to take whatever he could get at this time. And so he went to him and said, I'd really love to learn from you, but we don't have any money to pay you. And so Yehuda agreed and said, sure, I'll take you on as a student, no problem. So after going to school each day, Chagall would go to the studio and learn a little bit in the evenings. But after only a few months, he discovered that portrait painting wasn't really his thing. He loved art, but he wasn't excited by it. And so he said, I have to move to St. Petersburg. It's a lot like when I got out of school and I said, if I want to have an art career, I need to go to New York. So I liken that. So he told his mom and dad, I'm moving to St. Petersburg, and they didn't understand it at all. They said, this is completely impractical. Why would you want to make a career out of art? But he took a chance and moved anyway. Jewish men were not allowed to just live freely in St. Petersburg at that time, so he had to get a passport from a friend, a temporary passport. So he got that on the sly and then enrolled into a prestigious art school where he studied for 2 years in St. Petersburg. After school, he then became a student of Leon Bakst, who was also Jewish, and he was a designer of stage sets and costumes for the Ballet Russe. So at a very early age, Chagall was exposed to, you could do much more with art than just paintings to hang on the wall. You could have them in some sort of practical use, like the theater. And he was exposed to experimental theater there, and really thinking outside the box of uses for art. But also, that artist exposed him to the work of Paul Gauguin, which is an impressionist artist, but he definitely painted in a different realm. He would paint figures in Tahiti. He basically moved to Tahiti and lived on an island and painted the women there. So that was very different from anything that Chagall had been exposed to before. In 1910, Chagall's life changed when he went back to visit his family in Vitebsk, and he met the love of his life, Bella Rosenfeld. I'll be talking a little bit about that in just a few minutes when we transition to one of the images behind us. But in order to have a career and be able to provide for this woman, he said, I need to make it a little bit bigger. I'm gonna have to have some money, or her family is just not going to agree to let me marry her. So he decided to move to Paris in 1910. So he proposed to Bella and said, I will be back for you, but I have got to go and earn a living. So he moved to Paris. And at that time, Cubism had really taken hold in Paris. Picasso was all the rage, and Cubism is very much about explaining the outside world in shapes and lines. So that was very foreign to Chagall again. He's like, what is this? I paint from my heart. I paint memories. I paint in colors, and Cubism is often very dark. So he was very opposed to this style and just decided to hold up and do his own thing in Paris.
Wow.
He was lonely. He was unable to communicate because he didn't speak French. And so he immersed himself in painting memories of his home. And being separated from it really allowed him to go to internalize everything and paint from within versus what he was seeing on the outside. And that became a signature part of Chagall's art. He's very much known as painting from his heart, from inside.
So it's very emotionally oriented.
Absolutely. Very memory driven, very emotional, and very personal, his art is. He began then to incorporate symbols and motifs that would be signature in all of his paintings, like ghostly floating figures, fiddlers, livestock, fish, which represented his father as a herring merchant. And he wanted to have his own style and not be associated with any other style. So he was actively avoiding other influences at the time.
Really?
All right, let's see. So quickly he was noticed. His art was very different from what everyone else was doing in Paris at the time. And so he was invited to exhibit his work in Berlin. And he thought, well, this is a really great opportunity. I can take the artwork there, and then I can go back home. And I should have enough of a career to offer, so
Bella.
I can marry Bella. I can finally marry Bella. So that's what he did. He took 200 artworks to Berlin, dropped them off, and traveled back to Russia. And then World War I broke out.
Did he get any of the money from those paintings?
No.
Wow, I guess that's a lesson. Don't just drop them off.
He did not get any money from the paintings. He left them behind, traveled on, and his plan was to get to Russia, pick up Bella, marry her, and go to France. that was all shut down. The borders were shut down. He wasn't going anywhere. But he was able to marry his love. And much convincing to her family, he eventually was able to marry her. And a year later, they had their first child, Ida. But despite his growing success as an artist, there was the October Revolution in 1917 in Russia. Change of regime, things were all tossed in the air, and he was in a dangerous position. He could either align himself with the government and follow their rules, especially about art, or he could separate from them and be an outcast and put his family at risk. So he decided to take a government position, not the one that was offered to him, which was actually commissar of all of the arts of Russia.
Wow.
He took a lesser position in Vitebsk so he could stay closer to his family. And hopefully lay a little low and continue to do his own style of painting.
Although not everybody gets offered the position of head art commissar of all of Russia, right?
Absolutely. So he
So
turned...
that's pretty, that's quite the honor to even be honored, to offer that.
Absolutely. And he knew that. But he was smart enough to realize that would be putting him at risk in the long run. Because his style of art was not exactly academic. He had his own way, and that could be frowned upon. So he actually started an art school in Vitebsk, and it was now a very famous art school there. And he was offered a job as a stage designer for the new State Jewish Chamber Theater. So he fell into his mentor's footsteps, started designing murals and backdrops for theater, which eventually led him later in his career to design murals for the New York Metropolitan Opera and the Paris Opera House. He painted the entire ceiling at the age of 77 of the Paris Opera House. In 1923, Chagall and Bello were finally able to return to Paris. He was finally able to follow through with his plan. But first he decided to stop off in Berlin and go back and retrieve the 200 artworks that he had left there.
Wow.
10 years before. But they were all gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a long time.
Yeah. None of his earliest art survives.
Do we know where any of that ended up?
Some things have resurfaced over the years, but very few. Most of it was destroyed.
Wow.
Either in World War I or subsequently in World War II.
Wow.
So yes, what a loss. But in 1926, he had his first American exhibition. He was able to create quite a bit of artwork in those 3 years. So he had 100 works to send to New York. And in 1931, he had a commission to start to represent the Old Testament. Which then led to some of the artworks that we have here later. It actually took him years and years to complete this, but he started it off by traveling to Palestine and living there for 2 months and immersing himself in the culture so that he could really thoroughly represent it in his art. So again, it wasn't too long after that he was forced to make some life-changing decisions. World War II was creeping up on them. And he was living in Vichy, France, which him and other artists assumed was a safe haven. Not so much. Things quickly changed there. And despite his naivety, he realized that the only way to survive and keep his family safe was to come to the United States. So along with about 2,000 other European artists, writers, intellectuals, he was given refuge. He didn't have the money to come on his own. But he was brought to the United States and given a visa in 1941. Chagall's daughter was able to pack up much of his art that he had there into large cases, met with a spy who then took the rest of his art. It's just a fascinating story. And she packed it up and with her husband got on the SS Navamar, famous ship, and traveled with all of it to the United States. So he learned his lesson after the Berlin episode, and his art was more cared for this time.
It's one way to learn a lesson.
Absolutely. Chagall ended up really loving New York. He did not speak English, But he lived on 74th Street in New York, and he just loved the cultures. He loved the food, loved just all of the vibrancy that New York had to offer. There were so many European artists that had come there, so he did have a community.
Refugees from the war.
Absolutely.
Right?
So
Yeah.
there was a community there that he could associate with. And he ended up becoming friends with Andre Breton, which was another founder of Cubism. They were able to make friends in New York. He hung out on the Lower East Side quite a bit. Loved the Jewish culture, and he did speak Yiddish, even though he didn't speak English. And so he would read the Yiddish press every day to get his news. But tragedy struck again, just when he thought things were settling down. In 1944, Bella died suddenly. And he really blamed it on all of the tragedy and changes that they had in their life. She did just acquire a virus, and due to limited medical supplies during the war, she was unable to be treated, and she passed away. But he really took it to heart and saw that it was because of all of this, I guess, all the tumultuousness that he had gone through. And he blamed that and blamed himself. You know, it's really sad.
Wow.
He took a respite from art making, but by 1946, he was approached by the Museum of Modern Art for a retrospective. He had actually been an artist for 40 years and practicing, so they wanted to represent 40 years of his life in art. And then eventually in 1947, he returned to France, where he lived out the rest of his life. So there you go. There's the life story of Chagall. In a little, he did go on to remarry. But it was not necessarily a marriage of love. It was more of a marriage of companionship. She was a secretary. He didn't want to be alone. And most of his artwork then refers back to Bella. It was
Really?
yes, she was always his true love.
Wow.
So with that in mind, we can speak to one of the pieces that's behind us.
So now that we've gotten that wonderful background from Jessica on Marc Chagall, we're now going to talk about the paintings we have here in our building, starting off with this one. So I noticed that there is a woman who is colorfully presented, brightly in the middle, or at least most of the painting, and then various animals. What is going on with this painting?
I love that you said that. So we'll start off by saying it's actually a silk screen. It's a print.
Okay.
It is numbered in the bottom. One of our earlier series that we did, we talked about numbered prints, and this is one of them. Actually, all of the works we have are prints. They are signed by Marc Chagall himself, so they were authorized by him, but they are not original paintings. So this original painting was an oil painting done in 1912. Prints were made subsequently. This one is numbered. 340 out of 350 is the edition for it. It's signed here in the corner by Marc Chagall in blue. And you're right, there's this figure in the middle, and there's a lot of things going on around her. That is kind of Chagall's thing. He likes to have a central figure or figures, and then this swirling atmosphere around them. In a lot of cases, that swirling atmosphere is not necessarily what would actually be happening around the person or figures. It's more of what would be happening in his mind around those things that he would associate with those things.
Sort of almost like the feeling of the scene.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So he's very much about painting his internal processes and then putting them all together in one piece, which is one thing I've always really loved about Chagall, is rather than just being purely representational and painting what he sees or copying, he's able to bring what he's feeling and what he's thinking out onto the image. As an art therapist, that's kind of the thing that I'm always striving to help people do, is bring what's inside out.
Great.
So we have this figure. It's actually known as La Mariée, would be the bride. On the plaque below, it actually says Les Mariées, which would be brides of the village. It says au village. So a little translation issue there, perhaps, but this was a later print that was done subsequent to his original painting, so perhaps there was a change in the title at that point. The central figure is, of course, thought to be Bella. Around 1912 was just after their marriage, so she would be the figure there. And then when the prints were issued in 1950, it would have been a few years after her death. So he would be revisiting this image and her image quite a lot in his art.
Is there any significance to her being dressed in red versus white?
You know, I haven't read that, other than the red is just a vibrant color.
It definitely does stand out against the dimmer background.
It absolutely does. And she's in a quasi-wedding. I mean, she's got a veil, which makes us think of a bride. It's called the bride. But yeah, she's wearing red. You know, it's something that's always been questioned. I'm glad you brought it up. It's known by most viewers as an ode to love. But what's peculiar about it, not only that she's dressed in red, is what's kind of happening around her. You mentioned there's animals.
There's a goat playing a musical instrument, a fish, I don't know, holding a candle.
Yeah. So all of these would be personal symbols for Chagall. You know, I'd love to have a chance to talk to him about what they each mean. We do know for sure that the fish up in the corner near the table holding a candle would be representative of his father. And so it would be recollecting that. The city in the background is his hometown, Vitebsk. So that's where this love began. Most scholars say that he is representing himself as the male figure that is coming up and enveloping her in a hug, which would partly represent a lot of his guilt about leaving her in the first place, to go to Paris and then returning to collect her, but then all of these tragic events happening surrounding that, you know, wars and deaths, and she was, you know, taken basically out of her home and her family to go and support his life as an artist. So he had a lot of guilt about those things, and felt responsible for her. Now, the goat on the side playing the fiddle, or the cello maybe, I'm not sure, it's a musical instrument. Often Chagall would use animals to represent feelings and represent people in his life. So that's curious. There's another musician just off to the right here, playing a flute, and then
who's actually a human.
And there's and then there's some ghostly humans. If you look very close, you'll see there's a woman perhaps peering out between them. There's another person in the background, a couple more painted in there. These would have all been personal symbols of his to represent things surrounding his marriage. All right. The colors, I'll just mention one more thing before we move away, is Chagall is known as a master of color. So we see these really vibrant, rich tones. You said the red figure just pops right out against the blue. I mean, that is absolutely intentional. And if it were painted with a yellow background or a pink background, you wouldn't have the drama that you see in the image due to the contrast and the use of color.
Now that we've done that one over there, the bride, as it were, we now have three other ones near the bird cage up towards the front that are 3 of the 12 tribes of Israel, 12 of the sons of Jacob, of Israel, as it were. So the first one we have here is the tribe of Shimon, or Simon, and
Okay, well, I'm definitely going to ask you some questions about that, but let me give you guys a little background on what these 12 images, why they were created. So that's going to be the focus of the rest of our talk for today. In 1960, Chagall began creating windows for the synagogue of the Hebrew University's Hadassah Medical Center in Jerusalem. He was commissioned to do a design for 12 windows representing the 12 tribes of Israel. He spent 2 years on the project, and each window in real life measures 11 feet high and 8 feet wide.
Wow.
This was the biggest project he'd ever undertaken.
So he had to actually make those windows himself?
He worked with glass artists. I mean, he obviously had learned a little bit about stained glass making. That would be probably too much for him to do solely. So he started off with the images, which is why we have these. You know, a lot of his work would be created on paper and then translated into glass. And then subsequently, they thought it would be a nice thing to have prints made of the windows for people to buy and keep after visiting there, perhaps. So the windows represent the 12 tribes, as you mentioned, that were blessings by Jacob. And the most important aspect of these windows, and the reason Chagall was commissioned in general, was not necessarily his knowledge of the tribes, but of his use of color. So when it comes to stained glass, it's all about color and light. You can't really have these dark blacks and grays, and imagine the light coming through there wouldn't create the effect that you're looking for.
Yeah.
And so he was asked to do this because he was just a master of color. In the 1950s, actually, Picasso commented that Chagall will be the only painter left who understands what color really is. Because so
pretty high
many,
praise.
That's huge.
Yeah.
So many other artists had abandoned it in favor of form or abstracting form, or for all these other concepts. And Chagall, the entire time, really stayed true to his use of color throughout his career.
Wow.
So in 1962, when the windows were dedicated, Chagall spoke at a ceremony, and I'd love to share a quote from him because I think it sums up his approach to the whole project. He said, "For me, a stained glass window is a transparent partition between my heart and the heart of the world. Stained glass has to be serious and passionate. It is something elevating and exhilarating. It has to live through the perception of light. To read the Bible is to perceive a certain light, and the window has to make this obvious through its simplicity and grace. The thoughts have nested in me for many years, since the time my feet walked on the Holy Land, when I prepared myself to create engravings for the Bible. They strengthened me and encouraged me to bring my modest gift to the Jewish people, the people that lived here thousands of years ago, among other Semitic peoples." So he saw this as a real gift and opportunity for him to take his history, his visit to Palestine, growing up as a Hasidic Jew, to put all of these things together and give it as a gift to the Jewish people. It's really beautiful. The artworks that we will look at today are all color lithographs, like I mentioned, that were made subsequent to the windows. Each are numbered prints, hand-signed by Marc Chagall. So if you're coming to the lobby to visit these, the signature is in the right-hand corner. He signed them in pencil. And the works were engraved and printed by a gentleman named Charles Sorlier in collaboration with Chagall on watermarked paper. If you look really closely on some of them, you can actually see their watermark pressed into the paper. And they are each from numbered editions of 150. So you'll see in the corner on this one, it says 139 out of 150. And each one, it would be numbered of their edition of that print in the lower left-hand margin. So, all right, as you introduced it, this was the tribe of Simeon or Simon. It's there's so many spellings.
In Hebrew it's Shimon. And so how do you translate that? And typically it just gets translated as Simon. People want to say Simon. But
okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well,
and also it's funny because as a non-art person, having heard your description earlier, this, in contrast to the next two that we're going to see, there's not a lot of color. It's definitely, I can imagine for a window, this is pretty dark.
It is. It absolutely is dark. The background is definitely much more of a night sky color, a midnight blue.
It's fairly similar to the previous one we saw.
Absolutely. The blues are very similar, and it's meant to represent a night sky. In the bottom part, you can see kind of what's called a sleeping town necessarily underneath. So it's really meant to represent a very quiet and still scene. In contrast to what we see going on with the animals and the figures in the picture. So it's a deep indigo blue color. We have in the dark town below, you'll have to, when you come by, look very closely at it. It's just delineated in black. And then up in the top portion, we see these two bright colored orbs, one on the left and one on the right. One is more of a pink, the other is probably more of an orange in its original state. This has faded a little over time. Then we see a flying horse, a Pegasus perhaps, between them. Then we have this large central circle in the bottom. There's a bright yellow sun, and then again, this portion of the bottom is in darkness. The animals in the image are seen as like scattering in all directions. You know, one's going this way, another's going up, another's going this way, one's looking back. That's perhaps seen as a commentary on the tribe dissolving, according to the prophecy of Jacob. It actually says in Genesis 49, I will divide them in Jacob, scatter them in Israel. So Chagall tried to stay true to the text in as much as he could within his style. He obviously incorporates many personal symbols as well, and his own kind of take on the text, but he tries to represent it in some ways. I would love to hear what the Hebrew text says.
Great question, Jessica. The Hebrew on this is actually really fascinating. You mentioned chapter 49, where Jacob's giving his blessings to his kids, and what we have here is actually a quote from chapter 49. It's verses 5 and 6 in that chapter. It starts up here with Shimon, just Simon's name.
Okay.
Levi and his brother Levi, that they're brothers, that they're filled with sort of violence, and that's them, and that their vessels, that their tools are of violence and recklessness, and that he does not, and this is the next verse, that he does not want to be part of their council.
Oh.
He doesn't want to be included. I'm going to have none of this, that Simon and Levi are violent, basically.
Okay.
And so that's what the verse is, and maybe, who knows, maybe that's providing some context of what's going on with all these different animals, with the birds and the flying four-legged beings.
It definitely has some tension in the image due to the darker colors. And then this, again, movement away from each other. There's like some disquiet and tension happening there. So that absolutely makes sense as a reference.
Yeah.
So now we know what Chagall was thinking.
Yeah.
All right.
It's very dark. It's very dark because that was how Jacob perceived these two sons, Simon and Levi. And certainly here, for Simon in particular, we're about to see Levi. I'm sorry, no, we're not. Okay. Simon in particular. But I guess I don't know what he did for the Levi one, but that's how, from the perspective of Jacob, how he saw them.
Great.
And that's why it's so dark and crazy.
All right. That answers it. We'll move on to the next one.
As opposed to the dark colors that we saw in the Simon one, we have here Judah, Yehuda, and this is a lot more colorful. The color is popping off of it's really evident, really very noticeable,
Absolutely.
very red, just like Jessica's sweater here. It's not even in the shot, but I do want to point out, we finished off talking in the Simon one about the Hebrew in it, which is the verse used, and just as we had seen with the Simon painting or the printing of being from Genesis chapter 49, we too see here a quote from Genesis 49 from Jacob, that Yehuda, that your brothers will praise you. Which is, it's funny because Yoducha, will praise you, is just like the same root of his name. The whole point of Yehuda being called Judah is because his mother sought to praise having had him. So your brothers will praise you, and then it sort of cuts off mid-sentence that your hands will be on your foes. And that's probably why the hands are there. It's part of that verse. But once again, we have another animal that's really in the foreground. So
the animal is actually a lion, which was meant to represent Judah.
Yeah.
And so Chagall's being very literal in this image, as opposed to some of the other images where we have to really I'm not sure what that animal represents, but this one, it's pretty obvious. We understand that. From Genesis 49, it's written that he washes his garments in wine, his robe in the blood of grapes, his eyes are darker than wine. So Chagall chooses that wine, that red wine color, to pervade this. I mean, it's just like encompassing this image in red. You can't mistake it. And it almost looks like the color of smashed grapes. It's a reddish purple tone. Again, you notice the hands reaching. It's as if, and they're holding a crown or striving for the crown. And then we actually see the city that's represented back here is Jerusalem, because that would be in the territory of the tribe of Judah. And so Chagall tries to directly represent that in this image. This is a very composed image versus some of the other ones where we have things floating all over, we have tiny things hidden in the background. When you look closely at this one, there's really nothing in the background except a little bit of foliage. It's pretty empty, and it's just a centralized picture to represent this. It's more simple than the other images. All right.
One other thing I do want to point out is the crown up at the top. Typically, yes, we do see crowns up at the top, so that's not particularly different, but Judah is the tribe from which ultimately King David comes, and so that is basically the crown son, as it were, because the tribe of Judah is really the main monarchical tribe, as it were. Saul isn't necessarily, but David, Solomon, and their descendants are from the tribe of Judah.
So that would be a symbol of his lineage.
Yes.
There. Okay, excellent.
Moving on to the third and final tribe printing, as it were, we have Reuben here. Now, Reuben is actually the firstborn of Jacob's sons, and just as we have seen in the previous two prints that we have way up at the top, it's really fascinating because when we think about it, the Simon one, the Shimon, the Hebrew is really just in the bottom, right? And then when we came to Judah, okay, it's sort of there, sort of tucked in the bottom third of it off to the side. Here, very noticeably up at the top, almost a focal point of sorts.
Absolutely.
And just in line with the previous two, it is a verse from chapter 49 in the book of Genesis. And also, it cuts off, just as we've seen in the previous two. Why Chagall couldn't have used just two more words to complete the verse, incredibly unclear. But here it is, that Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and first fruit of my vigor, exceeding in rank and exceeding in honor. So this is verse 3 in chapter 49. So all of these are Jacob describing his children, his sons. But this one, it's actually featured up top.
Yeah, it's in a shape of like a sun, but the color choice is very interesting because it's a muted gray. And so it's not illuminated as you would think the sun would be. The entire image is of cool tones. We've got cool blues, greens, purple, with the exception of a few warm colors added here in the bottom of the image. But in general, it's very harmonious. We have birds and fish living where they should versus floating about in odd places. We have fish in the water below, and we have birds congregating in the sky. One is carrying a mandrake plant, which is actually one of the emblems of this tribe. And so he directly incorporates that here in the front and carrying a branch. But yeah, it's a peaceful image, which was meant to represent this tribe. Reuben was the firstborn, and I believe this was also the first in the series that Chagall created.
Which makes sense because Reuben was the firstborn of Jacob.
Yeah, I think he did create them in order, per se.
Cool.
All right.
Moving on from the Chagall prints by the bird cages, we also have these three Chagalls here in the Oakview apartments, which, just as we have seen with the previous three prints, are of the tribes of Israel, and all from really Jacob's description of them in chapter 49 from the book of Genesis. So Yeah.
Yeah, they're really still part of the same 12 series that we've seen before, done in exactly the same way. And we have 2 others tucked in over in the corner, which we're going to try to get for you, but the lighting is not as great, so bear with us on this so we can get the best view as possible. But yeah, we're going to cover these today as the second part of our series.
So now we have the first of the 3 of these tribe prints here in Oakview, and we start off with Issachar or Yisachar, and this is, as we have done before, from chapter 49 from the book of Genesis. This quotes from verse 14 in chapter 49 that Yisachar is a strong-boned donkey crouching among the sheepfolds. And if you see this, there's a lot of animal imagery, lots of animals. So it certainly makes sense talking about the donkey amongst the sheepfolds. So, yeah.
All right, I'll take it a little further. So this is one of my favorites of this series, of course, because it's green. Yeah, you guys have heard me say that a few times. But
you're a big green person?
Yeah, imagine that. If you look at this in person, it's definitely this beautiful emerald green. It's a really rich and lush color. I'm going to talk a little bit about the imagery because I have a quote from an art historian who's actually a Chagall expert.
Oh, wow.
I love Chagall. I like to think I know a lot, but maybe not as much as others. So there's an art critic named Jean Lemery, and she wrote a book called The Jerusalem Windows, specializing in this series. So in reference to that, she wrote about this one, and I thought it was really poignant. She said, "The harmony of the window rests on a dominant light green, tender and calm, which is the very expression of spring and paradisial joy." When you look closely at this one, it's highly detailed, but the details are all in black on green, so you have to look closely to see all of them.
A lot of foliage.
A lot of foliage. I'll go on a little bit more. It says, the vine, so often celebrated in the Bible as the principle of fertility, and especially as the mystic symbol of Israel itself. Interesting. Circles in a continuous garland around the window. So when you look closely at this, it actually has a border around it that's a vine, twisting and curling up. It actually has a little bit of a serpent look to it. In some places, it's like there's faces in it. So that's interesting. Chagall and his animals. The lovingly painted trees and plants in which birds perch exalt the luxuriant vegetation. So again, lots and lots of plants in this image. The robust ass, we have our donkey down there.
Here, but is that one also?
I think
maybe there are 2 of them.
so.
And maybe here possibly, or are these supposed to be the sheep?
I think those might be sheep.
Okay.
Yeah, we definitely have some birds up here, but it does look like there might be 2 donkeys. It symbolizes the tribe. That's actually the symbol of the tribe, as you mentioned before, and the splendor of his country. The weight which ought to bear as the tribute of a slave is sufficiently light for Chagall to represent it with humor by means of a tiny bird outlined in black. Up here? Well, actually, I would say a couple of birds. One notices in near transparency a prosperous village. So I do like to note this. I said there's a lot of details in this image. When you look closely, yeah, there's a village painted very clearly, but it's just not supposed to be the focus of it. And flocks spread out over the countryside. At the center, 2 hands in blessing here in front of this triangular shape that holds the text in the center. It's a triangle of light where the text of the first verse of Jacob's blessing is written in Hebrew. And it's supposed to really stand out in the image. And I think it does. It's, being so light up against this obvious green.
Right. Well, the absence of the green color, but also the splashes of this orange that really, aside from this purple and blue here, really are quite different than the rest of the animal green.
Absolutely. It's the only warm colors in the image, and it really draws our eyes to the text.
Yeah.
That's what Chagall's good at, using color. So there we go. All right, we'll move on to the next one.
Moving on to the middle print of Chagall's right here in Oakview, we have Dan. This is the tribe of Dan. And going back to chapter 49 in the book of Genesis, the scriptural quote that Chagall uses here is from verse 16 of, I'll say it in Hebrew first, because the way it sounds is really neat. Dan yadin amo ka'achad shiftei Yisrael. That Dan will judge, his name is Dan, so he will judge his people like one of the tribes of Israel. And so that's what we've got here. That's the scriptural verse. And you can also see it almost looks kind of like a scales of justice to some degree, and that goes back. I don't know. It could be that, but it almost looks more like a candelabrum.
I think it could be both simultaneously, and so he's using one symbol to represent both things. Very interesting. I love the way that the placement of the text is in this arc form on here. In some of the other ones we see it hidden in side shapes, but he's really working with the composition here. That
is interesting. The scriptural text appears differently in each of these prints. In the ones by the birdcage, they seem to be sort of towards the bottom. They're not prominently featured. What we just saw in Issachar, right in the middle triangle, the way the colors are playing off of each other really focuses on the verse. In this one, as you mentioned, it adorns the edge, the top, and the sides. So it works with the shape of it, and it's more prominent, but it also doesn't necessarily dominate or take as much attention as we saw in the Issachar one.
Absolutely, it actually kind of falls into the background here, but the placement is important. So a little bit more about this. We see this beautiful blue color, which we've seen in several of the other plates. It's coming back out, but there's lots of other colors mixed in with this one. The one we just saw previously was predominantly green with just a few splashes of color. This one has a lot of color throughout it. This large section of yellow in the middle to draw our eye in. And then we've got splashes of red and pink and purple and green. So we see a variety of colors in this plate.
Especially with the animals, and as opposed to the one previously with the Issachar one, they sort of were in the background. They were mostly also the emerald green, as most of the rest of the window had been here. Most of the animals, not all of them, most of the animals get their own distinct colors separating them.
Absolutely, and they're popping out all over the place. So you mentioned this form, and it is really central to it, whether it be a candelabrum or a scales. I think it is supposed to be a candelabrum, honestly, but other people have looked at it and likened it because of the judge aspect of it. You definitely have that semblance there, and the light of it is actually what's creating this yellow. It's like a glow coming from it. We also see red animals and a little bit of this green space, a little nature coming out in the background. This is actually supposed to be a lion cub. In my research,
I thought it was a squirrel.
Yeah, it's brown. The text that I read about said it was a reddish color, and so it maybe has a reddish brown. But it took me a moment to figure out what animal that is there in the center.
So I notice we've got a fish. Of course, you mentioned his father was a herring maker. But what's with the birds? Like, there were a lot of birds in the Issachar. There's birds in this one. The next one we'll see also has birds. What's his connection? He didn't make his father didn't make any bird food, right?
No. He definitely, that's a personal symbol for Chagall that he uses throughout his work. Sometimes it's a rooster. Other times it's just other birds.
What is he like about birds?
I don't know. It'd be a really great question to ask him. But birds often represent freedom. In artwork, they often represent transition. And so we know he had to move around constantly in his life. And not necessarily always by choice. It was just by circumstances. So the birds may possibly represent a lot of that transition that he had.
Cool, very neat.
All right, so one more thing I'll mention is we can't leave out that there is the central figure here is a serpent. And that is mentioned in the text?
Yes, it actually is, because in the very subsequent verse, in verse 17, Dan shall be a serpent by the road, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels so that his rider is thrown backwards. So we have this. So we actually do have animals in the very subsequent verse describing Dan here, and so we get a serpent very prominently featured in the middle, and then here we have, biting, I guess, at their...
I find it interesting that we have animals with holding weapons here as well, and we will see this in the next image too. So these animals are taking on these human characteristics. And here we have the lion cub holding the sword here, you know, wielding the sword. Down here we have the horses rearing away from the serpent, but they're also holding a sword as well. So there's some battle going on there.
Moving on to the third and final print here in the front of Oakview, we have the tribe of Gad. Now, or is G-A-D, but it's actually God is his name. Now the biblical verse here that we see, right, actually it's here up top in a crescent formation, and then also splashed in the sort of the middle, we have verse 19 from chapter 49. And just like I read out from the previous one, I'm going to do this in Hebrew first to listen to hear how it sounds, which is Gad Gedud Yugudenu. So there's 6 words in this verse, but the first 3 all sound like they have the same root together. Gad Gedud Yugudenu.
It's a tongue twister.
Right, and then Vahu Yagud Akev. So we get that same root then. 4 of the 6 words in this verse share that good, that aspect. The English translation is, God shall be raided by raiders, but he shall raid at their heels. So that just as he is being raided, yet he's going to raid back. So, but we have this akev here, which is a heel. So he's a raider. So, and that's probably also why, just as we had seen in the previous print, this notion of vipers at heels. And we also have a snake here and more snakes going on. So I think there's a sense of when one is raiding, there's a going after someone's heel, the akev.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I'm glad you noted the separation of the text here, because it's in a different composition from what we've seen on any of the others.
Yeah. And one thing I'm definitely going to point out with Jessica here is the greenness that overwhelms the emerald. But it's like a darker shade of emerald green than
I
what we
was
saw.
going to mention that, of course. I couldn't ignore that, and color is kind of my thing. It's definitely darker. The entire image, all of the colors are muted. As you know, they're not nearly as vibrant at what we're seeing, and I think that's the tone of the image. It's a battle scene we have going on here. There's a lot.
I know you mentioned, Jessica, in the previous one, the animals wielding weapons. Here, it's even more prominent. We have this like horse wielding a sword. There's a lot more going on. Even a shield, right?
Yes.
This bird wielding a shield.
The shield is beautifully represented. It's got kind of this sun design on it, and it is central of this protection that's happening there. But yeah, there's a lot of tension and a lot of conflict in this image. Just to take note that he represents it, but in a beautiful way, as if it's like spiraling and it's energetic because of the green. I mean, he could have painted this in even darker colors and made it, dismal. It's not, but we do get a sense of conflict and tension happening throughout it. As you noted, the spears, the shield, we do have a crown, which we've seen that show up in many of his images already. And it's kind of, it's a valiant image. I would say, it's not depressing. It's more of like raising up to the task of battle.
It's an action shot.
Yeah,
there's
it's totally an
there's a
action
lot
shot.
of action going on. It's an exciting picture.
Absolutely. Compared to the green that's opposite it here, which is calm and serene and peaceful, it's using the same colors but with a very different imagery to create a totally different feeling.
All right, so we have done 6 out of the apparently 8. We have 2 more prints in this series of the tribes. So we actually have not half of the tribes, we have majority of the tribes. So we have 2 more tucked away here in the Oakview lobby. And this one is of Naphtali. And the verse, which is interesting because so far the 6 prints that we have seen all feature a scriptural verse from chapter 49 in the book of Genesis. This has Naphtali's name, and yet there's nothing else from the verse. But the verse that refers in chapter 49 to Naphtali is in verse 21. Naphtali is a hind let loose, which yields lovely fawns. And so it's a animal imagery, which is right in the wheelhouse, it seems, of Chagall. Although we have a bird again, but we have here seemingly a fawn or a hide.
Absolutely, it's big. So we see the animals in some of the other images. They're much smaller. They're sometimes mixed up with lots of animals. This one, it is just big and blatant. The verse is short, that it's referring to, and very clear. And so he's just directly referencing that. So you mentioned the bird, and I would love to talk a little bit about that. I've noted in a few of Chagall's work the use of roosters. So we have a very colorful rooster in the top. And it's not necessarily a religious image, but it is definitely a symbol that is used throughout art history. And usually it's representing prosperity.
Okay.
So yeah, that's probably the reason it's used here. It's in a deep sapphire blue with some red accents, which is a stark contrast to the bright yellow background. It's
almost
just
like a calm yellow. It's like a calm, certainly what we saw in the previous ones, there was a lot of excitement, and with the colors going on here, the yellow is more of a calm, right?
It is. Yeah. It's calm, it's warm, it's inviting. But we have these vivid, saturated greens and blues up against it. It's a beautiful picture, you know. It's something that would stand alone and not even need to know the context of it. It does look like a lot of Chagall's other works from throughout his career. So the rooster, if it symbolizes prosperity and abundance, we see this overwhelming aura that it's kind of governing over it. It's flying over the deer. There's not a lot of other details, though, as opposed to the other pictures where you have all these little hidden symbols throughout the background. This one is just merely color. So there's really not a lot of detail here, but I do encourage you to come by, take a look at it. I'll say it's kind of tucked away in a corner, a little dark and dim, but if you can get the right lighting on it, it's really a jewel in our collection.
Moving on to our 8th and probably final print of the tribes here, based off of a verse of chapter 49 in the book of Genesis. I say presumably, you never know, maybe there could be several more tucked away somewhere within Cedar Village, but for the time being, this is the 8th, and at least for our presentation, our final tribe print. This one is the tribe of Joseph. Now, this, again, just as we had seen with the previous one of Naphtali, there is no verse anywhere to be found in the print, even though the first 6 that we had seen all had the verse or verses somewhere embedded within the print. I will read off, however, the verses that do pertain to Joseph in Genesis 49. If you want to keep track in your rooms, this is verses 22 through 24. Joseph is a wild donkey by a spring, wild colts on a hillside. Archers bitterly assailed him, they shot at him and harried him. Yet his bow stayed taut, and his arms were made firm by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, there the shepherd, the rock of Israel. Now, I mentioned the archers, the arrows. We have very clearly, very prominently, bow and arrow right here, which really takes center stage. It really draws one's attention, and it's also a bird, and yet a light pink bird.
The colors are different in this one, I will say. Even amongst Chagall, I can't say that pink is something that I have seen in much of his work.
Really?
Absolutely. Red for sure, green, blue, yellow, as we see. This is a really rich yellow. It's slightly darker than the one that we just viewed.
It's a little bit more orangey.
Yeah, it's got an amber kind of tone to it, but definitely yellow and warm. But pink is different, and this is by far the most colorful of all of the plates. We have a teal, kind of a turquoise color. We have a coral orange. We have green. So it's not as deep, dark colors as we've seen in some of the other ones, but they're vibrant. They're spring-like, which I think is coordinated with the text. What were you gonna? You were looking at the.
Well, there's more pink.
More pink.
I mean, we
yeah.
have obviously the pink bird. There's a little bit more pink over here, and then we get just another splotch of pink. So it just keeps appearing over there and there.
So yeah, it's a spring. It's like a bounty represented here. It's really blooming. It's lovely where it's located here in the Oakview lobby next to a window. So we see this natural light coming in. I think that there's some images in it that I would have some questions about and how I would love to know more. So maybe a little bit more research in the future, because there's some hands holding a shofar in the top. I would love to know exactly why Chagall included that. There's a wall here, which I think would reference where the tribe was located. So might be a little bit more research that we could do on this one, but it's certainly a beautiful image. I do know the location of this one is very interesting in the stained glass windows in Jerusalem. It is the one directly across from the entrance. And so one reason of using these bright light colors is it's meant to draw the visitors in to the synagogue and be a welcome to them. So it's the first thing that you would see when you walk in.
Cool.
So I think that that is an interesting choice on his colors and the placement of it in the Hadassah windows.
Yeah, it's also interesting the animals, because we have animals throughout those three verses, and we get these over here in this sort of lower right-hand quadrant, and it seems at least that that's some of these other prints of his are, there's just animals almost seemingly thrown in just for the fun of it. Here, at least, in this one and also the previous, it was very appropriate to the verses. It corresponded.
The location and composition of them as well. You know, they're grazing here. They're not flying through the air.
No, and well, I was about to say none of them are holding weapons.
Well, not so much.
Bird aside.
But it is definitely, even with the weapon, it's a calm and peaceful image, you know, in general. It's not a battle scene like we've seen before. So it's really another lovely piece, positioned in a beautiful way in here, juxtaposed with the other yellow. So I invite you to come and take a look for yourself.
So now that we've done all these 8 tribes, the prints of 8 of the 12 tribes throughout both Oakview and also by the bird cages, we have one final Chagall, also right here in the Oakview lobby, which is this picture of flowers, right, Jessica?
Yes, I mean, it's obvious that we have flowers. I believe the title is called Fruits and Flowers, just from looking. We don't have a title plate on it. We do have a signature, obviously, by Marc Chagall, and it is a print. It's not an original. It's number 130 out of a series of 500. This would have, just because of the style of it, been one of his later works. The reason I mention that is it's more fluid. We have very fine and tiny lines versus these bold lines that we see in some of his earlier work. And it's got a bit more of an impressionist style. So those of you that like the impressionists, the reason I say that is we've got his signature color in it, but it's got lots of texture and it's about light. He's painting a scene next to a window, so it's supposed to be in natural light. We see colors, but they're not quite as saturated as some of his other images. So we've got this kind of very muted blue over the whole tone, and everything looks a bit drippy and runny. So even looking closer, I love that. That's the signature of a lot of my paintings, is I just kind of let the paint run and flow together. So we don't have a separation of color, which is very signature of the Impressionists. They wouldn't necessarily divide the color. They would mix the color right there on the canvas and let it kind of flow one into another. We see a big bouquet of flowers and a bowl of fruit, hence the name Fruit and Flowers. But not to be missed is there's actually a couple, a tiny little couple in comparison to this large bouquet of flowers.
It's also a little bit hard to tell unless one's really looking at it. So it's an opportunity if you find yourself in Oakview to come check this out. But in the right-hand corner, the bottom corner, and it doesn't even merit separate colors. It's just part of that sort of that I don't know. It's a blue, but it's kind of a green also. It doesn't have the same vibrance of colors that we see up top.
Absolutely. The figure's very faint. It's a man holding a woman, and she's smiling and looking up. It's peaceful and serene. But yes, it's not supposed to be the focus of the image. It's just kind of sitting there in the background.
Although it stylistically fits with the rest of the feel of it, which is calm, serene, flowers and fruits just sitting there. And even this couple in the right-hand corner is just calmly sitting there, enjoying sitting there.
If I'm right in dating this to his later years, I will say that Chagall remarried after the love of his life, Bella, died. He did remarry several years later, but it was more of a marriage of convenience. They actually divorced and then remarried under different terms pretty quickly. And so in many of his works, he would reference love, but it would not be his current love. It would be his former true love. So the fact that it's painted lightly and off to the side would perhaps be a signature of his in doing a painting of memory. So it would be in reference to his memories of his true love. And then we've got all this life and bounty and flowers abounding, but that's just always kind of off to the side and in the background for him.
What prompted the change stylistically? You mentioned he had bolder colors and then he transitioned later on in his career to this. What prompted that?
For many artists, it's due to aging and changes in eyesight. And so we see in many of Monet's works, in his later years, things got darker. He actually had cataracts. Once those were removed, he actually painted over many of his images to make them brighter because he didn't necessarily know that he was choosing these darker and more muted colors. That is something that we do see in much of Chagall's later work. He did live to the age of into his late 90s.
Oh, wow.
And continued to create art throughout that time. And so color choices, vision, those are different. Mood is also an element of that. So in the earlier works and the works that we've looked at in this series, he was using color intensely because it was created for stained glass windows. And so if that was not the intention on this, some of the colors could be more muted to have a different tone.
Very neat.
All right. We are so happy that we've been able to bring this series to you and focus on some of the works that we have here in the building. Now that we have things opened up a little bit more, we invite you guys to get out, take a walk, and see these for yourself.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you for watching another Village Arts Insights with Jessica and me. I hope you enjoyed this. And this, as Jessica pointed out, these are all paintings we have right here, or prints right here within our own four or many other walls. So feel free to check them out. And now that you have this greater context, you can enjoy them up close and personal when you walk around.
All right, see you around.
Yep.